Hi there, and welcome to Fearless Focus. I am Diego Calero, that's Diego like the Spanish name. You say it as if it had a G, so Diego. And I am the director of the Institute Ethics, Rationality and the Future of Humanity in Brazil. And this is a series of videos which I'm going to be using mostly to my own personal satisfaction, in that I would like to better structure my thoughts by having to say things for 20 minutes non-stop about how I think about life, the universe and everything. So let me get a little bit more specific. Why is it called Fearless Focus? Fearless Focus means I'm going to take a very daunting approach to life. I'm going to, in general, persuade and suggest that one should pursue all the daunting moves that appear as a possibility, not meaning that you should take all risks that eventually face you, but meaning that in most of the cases it's more interesting to go on and live in a more adventurous way than it would have been if one decided to just, out of habit or out of comfort and security, keep doing the same things every day and night and so on. Why the focus? So I think that the main issue that faces our society today is the issue of how much information intake we have. So an information diet or an attentional diet is one of the most important properties of one's psychology that is desirable to both have and think about quite a lot. Basically meaning that one should pay a lot of attention to how are you going to allocate your attention, because this composes to a great extent how you are in terms of psychological traits and what you do and what should be done by you. So let's get started. I'm going to start by describing the parts of current physical science to which I ascribe, even though they are not necessarily considered mainstream theories of physics. So let's start by talking about the multivariate flavors of multiverses. Let's start with the easiest one. So it seems that according to current theory, our universe is expandable in any particular direction in terms of space, to the point that everything we see is not determined by how big space actually is, but only by how long light has had to reach us from a particular point in space. So I'm going to be assuming that space is infinite. So if space is infinite and we live in a finite world, that is a world with a finite number of configurations, which are each of which somewhat likely to emerge, that is, they have a probability of emerging in a subset of this infinite space, then there's going to be an infinite number of worlds which are just like our own, even within our one big universe. So this is a many universes in one theory, brought forth by Alex Pilenkin in around 1996, and I'm going to be assuming that this theory is mostly correct. I'm going to be assuming as well the many-world interpretation of quantum mechanics, meaning that when a quantum phenomenon seems to have split the world into two different ways of being, it actually has split the world in a sense, as opposed to there is a collapse of the wave function which makes a decision as to which of the particular states within the wave function is going to be the state to which an electron or a photon or whichever other particle goes to. So we have a branching state in which our universe is generating all the time as many different separate universes as is physically possible with the correct quantum theory, whatever it ends up being. So we do not have a current understanding of how quantum theory works in the specifics, but whichever are the specifics, it seems to me that it's mostly correct to say that some version of the many world interpretation is going to be the true one. One of the versions of the many world interpretation, which seems more philosophically tenable to me, is the one in which you have a huge superposition of states, and it is only in virtue of our macroscopic nature that we perceive the universe as if it was one of the quantum branches and not all of the other quantum branches it could have been, or this superposition of loads of different macroscopic states all happening at the same time. So I do think that to a great extent the way in which quantum mechanics works is more related to how we as macroscopic objects interact with the universe than it is related to how the universe itself physically behaves in collapsing wave functions and whatnot. In general, I'm going to be talking about beliefs by meaning that I ascribe a probability of above 80% to the truthness of a fact, and I'm going to be taking a mildly Bayesian approach to beliefs, meaning that I think that when we say something is true or something is false, we're summarizing a more complex belief in which we ascribe some probability to that particular thing being true or that particular thing being false. I don't think it's almost ever the case that you're 100% certain of something. So I'm going to be using this approach. Sometimes I will explicitly describe which probabilities I assign to particular metaphysical, physical, or other theories. But most of the times I'm just going to say that I think this is true and this is false, and you can take it to mean that I think it's less than 10% likely if it's false and more than 80% likely if it's true. So I take both the many world interpretation of quantum mechanics and the infinite space multiverse theory to be true in that sense, in that simplified sense. So which other flavors of multiverses are there? Max Tegmark has proposed what is called the mathematical universe hypothesis. This is a hypothesis in which our universe is a subset of all mathematical properties. So to reason about this, you have to consider the following ideas, more or less. It seems that mathematical properties are the things that would not vary from universe to universe. Not only are they invariant across universes, it seems to be the case that they would still remain true if there was no universe whatsoever to be spoken of. So mathematical truths are therefore independent of existing things, in that they are true whether or not there is anything that actually exists. And he puts forth an argument based on the anthropic principle, which I might have more time to talk about later, according to which our universe is actually composed of mathematical entities, and we are the kinds of minds that would emerge as a subset of those mathematical entities being true. Even though the interesting thing about the theory is that it does not require the existence of matter, the existence of universes, or similar things, which takes me to a particular assumption that is very unusual within philosophy. I'm going to be taking the assumption from Bertrand Russell and also Max Tegmark to think that matter does not have intrinsic properties. That is, all the properties that an electron has, it has in relation to other particles. So the charge, for instance, of an electron is a charge in how it relates to other electrons or to different particles. And the same is going to be true of any physical property whatsoever. That is, I am assuming in general that all properties are what David Chalmers would call relational properties. And that there is no such thing as the intrinsic structure of matters, which bears the properties that it could have in relation to different things. It's basically this nothing, which only in virtue of its relations is not a nothing anymore. It is the set of those relations. I'm not going to be committing to the existence of sets, but this is the most intuitive way in which I can talk about this. So, different shapes of universes. Then we have the mathematical universe hypothesis, and there is also the simulation argument by Nick Bostrom, which I'm going to be ascribing a 25% probability that we are living in a simulated universe. What does that mean? That means the argument in a very simplified form, assume that there's only 10 people in the world, and they create 10 simulations, each of which has 10 people themselves. So if it is possible to simulate consciousness or entities such as the kind of entities that we are, one would expect, if one was born in this particular universe, to be 10 times out of 11 one of the simulants rather than part of the base level civilization which created the simulations, which basically means that you're more likely, if simulations are possible and if there is no law enforcement against them, to be living in a simulation than it is to be living on the base level universe. I'm going to ascribe a 25% probability to living in a simulation because it does not seem to be clear at this point if we are or not able to create simulations of entities such as ourselves, which have a first-person perspective and are able to reason and have emotions and cognitions and even have what people confusingly call consciousness, if you will. Another flavor of multiverse is David Lewis's, that's a metaphysical version of multiverse, which states that all possible universes exist. It is very similar in some respects to the mathematical universe hypothesis, and it may be a metaphysical version which is a little more comprehensive of what ended up being the many-world interpretation of quantum mechanics. So Lewis states that in all relevant meanings of existence, all possible universes exist, and he differentiates the universe in which we are by calling it actual, even though actuality for him does not mean in any way that ours exist and the others don't. There is no particular fire which breathes into this universe, in that it exists and the others do not. So I'm going to be ascribing about a 20% probability to this flavor of multiverse, so it does not need to be accounted as something I'm going to be presupposing. So let's go to the biological assumptions that are going to be assumed here. And please notice I'm going to be talking about life and how to live life and so on and so forth, even though I've been talking about philosophy and I'm going to be talking about science for the first few videos. That's because it seems to me that one's life should be governed by one's knowledge of the world around you, and it seems to me to be the case that sometimes, many times, facts about how the universe is, even though they come from the physical sciences or different sciences, are going to be very relevant in establishing a conduct for how one should behave. And here we go. The very first and most important thing that I have to say about biology is that I agree with the mainstream biological evolutionary thesis called Neodarwinism, and I'm going to go even forward and come out of the closet as a memeticist. That means that I consider genes and memes to be the only designer entities in the world. That is, in virtue of how they replicate, in virtue of how they evolve. Genes are responsible for the creation of all design that can be found in the universe, except for very few not that interesting shapes, such as round shapes of planets or the round-like shape of a soup bubble. And but for the very vast majority of it, I think that replicators trying to become more effective at replicating themselves are responsible for the creation of all design that there is around us in all its beauty, majesty, and horror, because there's a lot that is horrible about the universe. We're going to talk about that eventually. I take memetics to be a good approach to thinking about cultural science. That is, I think that a new replicator emerged with the spreading of human cultures, and this replicator is the meme. And there is a new theory which tries to use both memes and genes to think about populationally about culture, which comes from Richardson and Boyd. This is called the double inheritance theory. And I'm also going to be subscribing to that being the correct way of explaining how culture has evolved, even though it cannot capture all the tiny, personal, individual, specific, random properties that culture has given rise to. It definitely can give you a framework to think about culture which works better than any other framework, because it does not require entities coming from above with skyhooks and capturing everything else and giving mental explanations to non-mental things, as opposed to giving non-mental explanation to mental things. So I'm going to be taking Neodarwinism, memetics, and the double inheritance theory as facts. That means I believe in them more than 80%. Finally, I'm going to take a stance on psychology and consider that the most prolific, interesting theories about psychology that we have today are evolutionary psychology, positive psychology, cognitive science, and cognitive neuroscience. This is a stance against the theories of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, Jungianism, and different forms of ways of thinking about the mind. In particular, I'm going to be taking a very computational view on what the mind does, regardless of what the mind is. And in this way, I suspect I'm going to be within a realm of established or not yet mainstream science, which is sufficiently thin to allow me to actually think about how to go about living one's life and going across in the world. So if you like those assumptions, or if you think that they're wrong but you're interested in knowing how a person that considers those assumptions to be true should go about living, then please continue with me, and we'll have an interesting journey towards the ways in which life can be lived. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about the philosophical assumptions that will be taken for granted in order to think about how one should go about in the world, as opposed to the more descriptive properties that I have told you about so far. Most of the videos are going to be 20 minutes non-stop. There's going to be exceptions, such as when the phone rings, and they are mostly to myself, so I'm not going to be that much worried about explaining every single thing, but I'll try my best to give at least a way to think about those things in which one can find different sources for the ideas that I'm proposing, or in general that might be attractive to you. So this is the end of the first video, and I can continue as soon as possible.